Our first stop has no headstone, no cemetery you can visit, no flowers left by admirers. Hart Island in the Long Island Sound is New York City's Potter's Field, the place where the unclaimed and unidentified dead have been buried since 1869. Over 1 million people are interred here in mass graves. Among them, somewhere in an unmarked trench, lie the remains of Bobby Driscoll. If you grew up watching Disney films in the late 40s and early 50s, you knew Bobby Driscoll's face. He was the first actor Walt Disney ever signed to a personal contract. He starred in Song of the South, So Dear to My Heart, and Treasure Island. He provided the voice and served as the live-action model for Peter Pan in the 1953 animated classic. He won a Juvenile Academy Award, a special Oscar given to outstanding child performers, for his work in So Dear to My Heart and The Window. At his peak, he was earning $1,750 a week, the equivalent of more than $20,000 today. Then, adolescence arrived. Driscoll developed severe acne, and Disney quietly dropped him just weeks after Peter Pan premiered. The studio simply stopped letting him through the gate. He found some work on television, but the roles dried up. By his early 20s, he had fallen into drug use and was arrested multiple times. He served time in prison. After his release, he drifted to New York's Greenwich Village, where he tried to make a living as an artist in the avant-garde scene. On March 30th, 1968, 2 boys playing in an abandoned tenement building in the East Village found the body of a man lying on a cot. There were 2 empty beer bottles and some religious pamphlets on the floor beside him. He had no identification. The medical examiner determined that he had died of heart failure caused by advanced hardening of the arteries, likely worsened by years of drug use. He was 31 years old. No one claimed the body. No one could identify him from the photographs that were circulated around the neighborhood. He was buried as a John Doe on Hart Island. It was a year and a half before his mother, who had been trying to find him, enlisted Disney's help. A fingerprint match at the New York City Police Department confirmed the identity of the man in the pauper's grave. The boy who flew over Neverland, the boy who never wanted to grow up, had died anonymous and alone in a city of 8 million people. His name appears on his father's headstone at Eternal Hills Memorial Park in Oceanside, California, but his remains are still on Hart Island. From New York, let's travel to the other coast. In Culver City, California, at the grounds of Holy Cross Cemetery, a sprawling Catholic burial ground just off Slauson Avenue. In the grotto section, 3 rows in front of a stone stairway leading to a hillside shrine, you'll find a flat, ground-level marker for a man whose name still sends a chill down the spine. Bela Lugosi, the Hungarian-born actor who became Count Dracula in the 1931 Universal film and never escaped the role, lies here beneath a simple stone that reads, Beloved Father. Lugosi was born Bela Ferenc Dezo Blasco in 1882 in the town of Lugoj, then part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He was a serious stage actor in Hungary, appearing in over 170 productions before fleeing to Germany after the collapse of the Hungarian Soviet Republic in 1919. He eventually made his way to America, where his thick accent and commanding presence landed him the lead in the Broadway production of Dracula in 1927. When Universal decided to film it, Lugosi had to fight for the role. The studio initially wanted Lon Chaney, but he got the part, and it made him immortal. The trouble was that it also made him unemployable for anything else. Hollywood typecast him relentlessly, offering him nothing but horror roles that grew smaller and cheaper as the years went on. A back injury led to a dependence on morphine and methadone that dogged him for decades. By the 1950s, Lugosi was making films for Ed Wood, widely considered the worst director in Hollywood history. He voluntarily checked himself into a hospital to treat his addiction, one of the first celebrities to do so publicly. Frank Sinatra, who had never met Lugosi, heard about his troubles, visited him in the hospital, and quietly helped cover expenses. Lugosi died in his sleep on August 16, 1956, at the age of 73 from a heart attack. His fifth wife, Hope, found him in their small Los Angeles apartment with a copy of an Ed Wood script in his lap. He left behind about $1,000 in cash and a few modest parcels of real estate. His family could not afford his funeral. His fourth wife, Lillian, and his son, Bela Jr., decided he should be buried in his Dracula cape. Contrary to the popular legend, Lugosi himself never requested this. Vincent Price and Peter Lorre were among those who attended the service. Here at Holy Cross, he shares the grotto section with Bing Crosby, just 6 graves down the same row. From the warm California sun, let's travel 3,000 miles to the heart of Manhattan and a building most people walk past every day without a second thought. The New Yorker Hotel at the corner of 34th Street and 8th Avenue is now a busy midtown hotel. But in January of 1943, it was the final home of one of the greatest inventors in human history. Nikola Tesla spent the last 10 years of his life in rooms 3,327 and 3,328 of this hotel, alone, feeding pigeons on the windowsill, living on milk, bread, honey, and vegetable juices. A plaque on the building's exterior and another on the door of room 3,327 mark the spot today. Tesla was born in 1856 in what is now Croatia and emigrated to the United States in 1884 with 4 cents in his pocket and a letter of introduction to Thomas Edison. He briefly worked for Edison before the two had a bitter falling out over the merits of alternating current versus direct current. Tesla's AC system won that war and became the standard that powers the modern world. He held over 300 patents. He developed the Tesla coil, contributed to the invention of radio, pioneered X-ray imaging, and envisioned wireless communication decades before it existed. At the height of his fame in the 1890s, he was throwing celebrity-packed dinner parties at the Waldorf Astoria, attended by the likes of Mark Twain. But Tesla was terrible with money. He tore up a royalty contract with Westinghouse that would have made him one of the richest men in America. Investors abandoned him. His laboratory burned down, destroying years of research. By the 1930s, he was living off a modest stipend from Westinghouse and the charity of a few admirers. He became reclusive, spending his days walking to nearby parks to feed pigeons, developing an intense attachment to one particular white pigeon that he claimed to love as a man loves a woman. On the night of January 7, 1943, at the age of 86, Tesla died alone in his hotel room. His body was not discovered until the following day, when a maid entered the room despite a "Do Not Disturb" sign that had been on the door for 2 days. The cause of death was coronary thrombosis. His nephew rushed to the hotel but found that Tesla's papers and notebooks had already been seized by the federal government, which classified them as top secret. Tesla's ashes were eventually sent to Belgrade, Serbia, where they are kept in a golden sphere at the Nikola Tesla Museum. The man who lit up the 20th century left this world in a dark, quiet hotel room, alone with his pigeons and his thoughts. Staying in the New York area, let's drive about 20 miles north of Manhattan to Hartsdale, to the grounds of Ferncliff Cemetery. This is a large, well-maintained mausoleum and cemetery complex, and it is the final resting place of Judy Garland, born Frances Ethel Gumm in Grand Rapids, Minnesota, in 1922. There is probably no one in American popular culture whose talent and suffering are more intertwined than Judy Garland. She was 2 years old when she first performed on stage with her 2 older sisters. She was 13 when she signed with Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. She was 16 when she sang Over the Rainbow in The Wizard of Oz, a performance so perfect that the song became inseparable from her identity for the rest of her life. MGM recognized her talent and exploited it ruthlessly. The studio put her on a regimen of amphetamines to keep her energy up during long shooting days, and barbiturates to bring her down at night. She was told she was too fat, too plain, not glamorous enough. By the time she was in her 20s, she was addicted to pills and struggling with her weight, her self-image, and her mental health. She made brilliant films, Meet Me in St. Louis, Easter Parade, A Star is Born, and was nominated for 2 Academy Awards, winning neither. She was married 5 times. She was fired by MGM in 1950 and spent the rest of her career in a cycle of spectacular concert comebacks and devastating personal collapses. Her Carnegie Hall concert in 1961, released as a live album, spent over a year on the Billboard charts and won 5 Grammy Awards, including Album of the Year. But debts followed her everywhere. She owed roughly $4 million to the IRS at the time of her death. The agency had seized her home. In her final months, Garland was living in London with her 5th husband, Mickey Deans, in a rented mews house in Chelsea. On June 22, 1969, Deans found her dead in the bathroom, sitting on the toilet with her head slumped forward. She was 47. The coroner ruled her death an accidental overdose of barbiturates. She had been taking Seconal for years to sleep. Her body was flown back to New York, where over 20,000 people filed past her coffin at a funeral home on Madison Avenue. She was initially interred in a crypt at Ferncliff Cemetery. In 2017, her remains were moved to a new resting place at the Hollywood Forever Cemetery in Los Angeles at the request of her children, Liza Minnelli, Lorna Luft, and Joey Luft. So if you visit Hollywood Forever today, you can pay your respects there. Let's stay on the East Coast and drive south to Baltimore, Maryland, to a small burial ground at the corner of Fayette and Green Streets, in the shadow of the University of Maryland Law School. Westminster Hall and Burying Ground is one of the oldest cemeteries in the city, established in 1787. And at the front entrance, marked by a white marble monument with a bronze medallion portrait, lies Edgar Allan Poe. Poe's connection to Baltimore was lifelong and tangled. He was born in Boston in 1809 to itinerant actors. His father disappeared, and his mother died of tuberculosis when he was 2. He was taken in by a Richmond merchant named John Allen, who gave him his middle name but never formally adopted him. After a falling out with Allen, Poe landed in Baltimore, where he lived with his aunt Maria Clem and married her daughter Virginia, his first cousin, who was 13 at the time. He was 27. From Baltimore and later from Philadelphia and New York, Poe produced the body of work that essentially invented the modern detective story and the psychological horror tale. The Murders in the Rue Morgue, The Telltale Heart, The Fall of the House of Usher, and of course, The Raven, which made him famous in 1845. But fame did not bring fortune. Poe was paid about $9 for The Raven. He scraped by as an editor and critic, earning a reputation for brilliant but savage literary reviews that made him powerful enemies. His wife Virginia died of tuberculosis in 1847, and Poe spiraled. In October of 1849, he was found delirious on the streets of Baltimore, wearing clothes that were not his own. He was taken to a hospital, where he drifted in and out of consciousness for 4 days, reportedly calling out the name Reynolds. No one knows who that was. He died on October 7th at the age of 40. The exact cause of his death remains one of American literature's great mysteries. Theories range from alcohol poisoning to rabies to a practice called cooping, in which gangs would kidnap men, drug them, and force them to vote repeatedly in elections. Only about 7 people attended his funeral. He was buried in an unmarked grave toward the back of this cemetery. It took 26 years and a fundraising campaign by Baltimore school children who collected pennies before a proper monument was erected and his remains were moved to this prominent spot at the entrance. His wife Virginia and his aunt Maria Clem were reinterred alongside him. Today, the grave is one of Baltimore's most visited landmarks. For decades, a mysterious figure known only as the Poe Toaster appeared at the grave every year on Poe's birthday, leaving 3 roses and a half bottle of cognac. The tradition ended around 2009, and no one ever confirmed who the visitor was. From the man who invented the horror story, let's turn to a woman who reinvented the American novel and travel south to Fort Pierce, Florida. At the end of a quiet residential street, past a pair of stone pillars, lies the Garden of Heavenly Rest, a small cemetery that was once segregated. It is here that Zora Neale Hurston was buried in 1960, in a grave so unmarked that it took another writer 13 years to find it. Hurston was born in Notasulga, Alabama, in 1891, and grew up in Eatonville, Florida, one of the first self-governing all-black towns in America. She was brilliant, charismatic, and fiercely independent. She studied anthropology under Franz Boas at Columbia, traveled the rural South collecting folklore and oral histories, and became one of the central figures of the Harlem Renaissance. Her masterpiece, Their Eyes Were Watching God, published in 1937, is now considered one of the greatest American novels of the 20th century. It tells the story of Janie Crawford, a black woman in the rural South searching for love and self-determination, and its prose has the rhythm and richness of spoken language. When it was published, though, it received mixed reviews. Richard Wright dismissed it as carrying no theme or message. It fell out of print. By the 1950s, Hurston's literary career was over. She worked as a substitute teacher, a librarian, and a maid to pay her bills. The largest royalty check she ever received for any of her books was $943.75. In 1959, she suffered a stroke and entered the St. Lucie County Welfare Home. She died there on January 28, 1960, of hypertensive heart disease, penniless and largely forgotten. Neighbors took up a collection to pay for her funeral. They raised just over $600, not enough for a headstone. She was buried in an unmarked grave in this segregated cemetery, and within a few years, the grounds had become overgrown with weeds and overrun with snakes. In 1973, a young writer named Alice Walker traveled to Fort Pierce to find Hurston's grave. Walker waded through waist-high weeds until she stumbled into a sunken rectangular depression in the earth that she believed was the burial site. She purchased a gray headstone and had it engraved with the words, Zora Neale Hurston, a genius of the South. Walker's essay about the search, published in Miss Magazine in 1975, reignited interest in Hurston's work. Their Eyes Were Watching. God was brought back into print and is now taught in schools across the country. Hurston went from forgotten pauper to literary icon, but only because another writer refused to let her disappear. Heading now to the Deep South, to Montgomery, Alabama, and a hilltop in the Oakwood Cemetery Annex on the northeastern edge of the city. A granite sign on Upper Wetumpka Road points the way. Drive in and bear right at the top of the hill, and you'll see two tall marble monuments rising from a patch of bright green artificial turf. This is the grave of Hank Williams, the man many consider the greatest country songwriter who ever lived. Hank was born Hiram King Williams in Mount Olive, Alabama, in 1923. He got his first guitar at the age of 8 and learned to play from a black blues musician named Rufus Payne, known locally as T-Tot. By his teens, he was performing on local radio. By his mid-20s, he was a member of the Grand Ole Opry and one of the biggest names in country music. Lovesick Blues, Cold, Cold Heart, Hey, Good Lookin', Your Cheatin' Heart, Jambalaya, I'm So Lonesome I Could Cry. These songs didn't just define country music. They laid the groundwork for rock and roll. But Williams was born with a mild spinal defect that caused him chronic pain, and he managed that pain with morphine and alcohol. His drinking was legendary and destructive. The Opry fired him in 1952 for unreliability. His first wife, Audrey, divorced him. On New Year's Eve, 1952, Williams was supposed to perform at a concert in Charleston, West Virginia, but an ice storm prevented him from flying. He hired a college student named Charles Carr to drive him in his baby blue Cadillac. A doctor at a hotel in Knoxville injected him with vitamin B12 laced with morphine. Carr drove through the night, and when he stopped for gas in Oak Hill, West Virginia, in the early hours of January 1, 1953, he realized that Williams was no longer sleeping. He was dead in the back seat, still wearing the navy blue overcoat he'd pulled over himself. He was 29 years old. The funeral in Montgomery drew an estimated 20,000 mourners to the city auditorium, one of the largest funerals the South had ever seen. Roy Acuff, Red Foley, and Ernest Tubbs sang. Williams was laid to rest here at the Oakwood Annex, and his gravesite has become one of the most visited in Alabama. Fans used to pluck blades of grass from around his monument as souvenirs, until it became impossible for anything to grow. The cemetery eventually replaced the natural grass with astroturf, which is why the green around his grave is so conspicuously vivid today. From one voice that defined its era, let's turn to another. We're heading north now to Warren, Michigan, just outside Detroit, to Detroit Memorial Park East on 13 Mile Road. This was one of the first cemeteries in Michigan established specifically so that black families could have dignified burials, founded in 1925 by a black state legislator and mortician named Charles Diggs Sr. In Section D, near a mausoleum called the Garden of Love, a flat stone reads, Florence Glenda Chapman, beloved wife and mother. Most people know her by her maiden name, Florence Ballard. Florence Ballard was the founding member of the Supremes. She was the one who brought the group together, recruiting her friend Mary Wilson, who in turn brought in Diana Ross. Ballard suggested the name Supremes, which the other members initially thought sounded like a male group. Starting in 1964, the trio became the most successful female vocal group in history. Where did our love go? Baby love. Stop. In the name of love. You can't hurry love. I hear a symphony. The hits kept coming. 10 #1 singles in all, while Ballard was a member. But Motown founder Berry Gordy had eyes only for Diana Ross. He gradually pushed Ross to the front, renamed the group Diana Ross and the Supremes, and marginalized Ballard and Wilson. Ballard, who many felt had the strongest voice of the three, grew depressed and turned to alcohol. She began missing performances. On the day after her 24th birthday, during an engagement at the Flamingo in Las Vegas, Gordy had her removed from the group. Cindy Birdsong replaced her. Ballard signed a solo deal with ABC Records, but without the right to use the Supremes name, her 2 singles went nowhere. Her settlement money from Motown was embezzled by her own attorney. Her marriage fell apart. Her home was foreclosed. By the early 70s, the woman who had helped create one of the biggest acts in pop music was living on welfare and struggling with alcoholism. She had been making a cautious comeback, performing at a benefit concert in Detroit in 1975 that was warmly received, when, on February 22, 1976, she collapsed and was rushed to a hospital. She died of cardiac arrest. She was 32 years old. Her funeral drew the 3 original Supremes together for the last time. Diana Ross and Mary Wilson, who had barely spoken in years, stood side by side at the service. Ballard was the first woman posthumously inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame as a member of the Supremes in 1988. Staying in the world of music but shifting to jazz, let's head to the Bronx, to St. Raymond's Cemetery, a large Catholic burial ground in the Throgs Neck neighborhood. Somewhere in the sprawling grounds, the exact location is sometimes difficult for visitors to find, lies a woman whose voice remains one of the most recognizable in the history of American music. Billie Holiday is buried here under a flat stone that bears her married name, Eleanora Fagan McKay. Born Eleanora Fagan in Philadelphia in 1915, Holiday had one of the most difficult childhoods imaginable. She was raised in poverty in Baltimore, was assaulted as a child, and worked in a brothel with her mother as a teenager. She arrived in Harlem in the early 1930s and began singing in clubs, where her extraordinary, emotionally raw vocal style caught the attention of producer John Hammond. She never had vocal training. She couldn't read music, but she could take a song and make it sound like no one else had ever sung it before. Her recording of Strange Fruit in 1939, a searing protest against lynching in the American South, is often called the first great protest song in popular music. God Bless the Child, Lady Sings the Blues, I'll Be Seeing You, Lover Man. Each one bears her unmistakable stamp. But Holiday spent much of her adult life battling heroin addiction. She was arrested, convicted, and sent to a federal reformatory in the late 1940s, which cost her the cabaret card she needed to perform in New York City clubs. Even as her fame grew, she was often barred from performing in the city that loved her most. Her personal relationships were with men who were frequently abusive. By her final years, her voice, never powerful in the conventional sense, had become thin and ravaged. She was still performing, still recording, but the toll was visible. On May 31, 1959, She collapsed and was taken to a hospital in New York, where she was diagnosed with cirrhosis of the liver and heart disease. While she lay in her hospital bed, police arrested her for narcotics possession. A bag of heroin had reportedly been found on a nightstand. She died on July 17, 1959, at the age of 44. She had 70 cents in her bank account and $750 strapped to her leg. From the world of jazz to the world of silent comedy, and from the East Coast back to California, Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Hollywood Hills is one of the most famous cemeteries in the country, and in its courts of remembrance, you'll find the final resting place of one of cinema's original geniuses. Buster Keaton was the great stone face, the man who never smiled on screen and made the world laugh harder than almost anyone. Joseph Frank Keaton was born in 1895 in Piqua, Kansas, to a family of vaudeville performers. By the age of 3, he was part of the act. His father would literally throw him across the stage, and the toddler learned to take falls so expertly that Harry Houdini, a family friend, supposedly gave him the nickname Buster. In the 1920s, Keaton became one of the biggest stars in Hollywood. The General, Sherlock Jr., Steamboat Bill Jr., The Cameraman. These films are still studied and revered. He performed all his own stunts, including one in Steamboat Bill Jr., where the entire facade of a house falls on him and he survives by standing in exactly the spot where an open window passes over his body. The margin for error was inches. Then talkies arrived and MGM took control of his career. The studio didn't understand him, saddled him with scripts that wasted his talents and stripped him of the creative freedom that had made his silent films masterpieces. His first marriage collapsed. He descended into alcoholism so severe that he later said he couldn't remember entire years of his life. By the 1930s and 40s, Keaton was working as an uncredited gag writer for other comedians at MGM, earning a fraction of what he once had. The general public had largely forgotten him. A revival of interest began in the 1950s when film scholars and a new generation of comedians recognized his genius. He appeared in a few films, including a heartbreaking cameo in Sunset Boulevard alongside fellow silent-era relic Gloria Swanson. He died of lung cancer on February 1, 1966, at the age of 70. By then, recognition had come back to him, but the years of obscurity and alcoholism had taken their toll. His grave at Forest Lawn Hollywood Hills is a modest flat marker. Not far away, at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale, the original and larger Forest Lawn, rests another figure whose talent was immense and whose end was tragic. Dorothy Dandridge, in 1954, became the first black woman ever nominated for the Academy Award for Best Actress for her role in Carmen Jones. That nomination alone would have secured her a place in history. But Dandridge was also a gifted singer and one of the most stunningly beautiful women in Hollywood. She was born in Cleveland in 1922 and began performing as a child with her sister Vivian as the Wonder Kids. She worked steadily in films throughout the 1940s, often in small, racially stereotyped roles that gave her little to work with. Carmen Jones changed everything. Directed by Otto Preminger, the all-black musical gave Dandridge a role worthy of her abilities, and she delivered a performance that stunned audiences and critics. She graced the cover of Life magazine. She headlined at top nightclubs in Las Vegas, though she was forbidden from staying at the hotels where she performed because of the color of her skin. She once dipped her toe in a hotel swimming pool and the management drained the entire pool the next day. After Carmen Jones, Dandridge struggled to find roles. Hollywood had no idea what to do with a black leading lady in the 1950s. She appeared in Island in the Sun and Porgy and Bess, but never again found a part that matched her talent. Bad investments wiped out her savings. A crooked manager embezzled her earnings. She was declared bankrupt. On September 8, 1965, she was found dead in her small West Hollywood apartment. She was 42. The cause of death was an overdose of an antidepressant, though it was never conclusively determined whether it was accidental or intentional. She had less than $2 in her bank account. Her grave at Forest Lawn Glendale is in the Freedom Mausoleum. Dorothy Dandridge's story of being shut out by Hollywood because of race has a painful echo just a short drive away. At the Angelus Rosedale Cemetery on Washington Boulevard in Los Angeles, one of the oldest cemeteries in the city and one of the first to accept all races and creeds, lies Hattie McDaniel, the first African American to win an Academy Award. McDaniel was born in Wichita, Kansas in 1895, one of 13 children of formerly enslaved parents. She became the first black woman to sing on American radio in 1931 and went on to appear in more than 300 films. But she is remembered above all for one role, Mammy in Gone with the Wind. Her performance earned her the Oscar for Best Supporting Actress in 1940, making history. At the ceremony, she was seated at a small table in the back of the room, separated from her white castmates by the hotel's segregation policy. She was not allowed to attend the film's premiere in Atlanta. McDaniel was a complex figure. She was criticized by members of the black community, including the NAACP, for playing roles that they considered demeaning stereotypes. Her response was direct and unapologetic. She said she would rather play a maid than be one. After Gone with the Wind, she continued working steadily, starring in the radio and television series Beulah in the late 1940s. But the work slowed, and her health declined. She was diagnosed with breast cancer and died on October 26, 1952, at the age of 57. 3,000 mourners attended her funeral, and 125 limousines accompanied the hearse. Here is the detail that makes this story cut deepest. McDaniel's final wish was to be buried at Hollywood Memorial Park, now Hollywood Forever Cemetery, among the stars she had worked alongside her entire career. The cemetery refused because she was black. She was buried instead at Angelus Rosedale. Decades later, in 1999, Hollywood Forever erected a cenotaph in her honor, a belated gesture toward the woman who had won their industry's highest prize and been told she still wasn't welcome. Speaking of Forest Lawn, Glendale, just a short walk away rests a man who lived as large as anyone in Hollywood and died far from the spotlight. Errol Flynn was the definition of a swashbuckler, on screen and off. Born in Hobart, Tasmania, in 1909, he led an almost comically adventurous youth, bouncing around New Guinea, working as a gold prospector, a tobacco farmer, and a patrol officer before stumbling into acting. Hollywood cast him as Captain Blood in 1935, and overnight he became the biggest action star in the world. The Adventures of Robin Hood, The Seahawk, they died with their boots on. Flynn was dashing, athletic, and apparently fearless. Off-screen, he was just as reckless. He drank prodigiously, used drugs, and was involved in a statutory rape trial in 1942 that, while it ended in acquittal, gave rise to the phrase, "in like Flynn." His lifestyle aged him far beyond his years. By his late 40s, he looked like a man in his 60s. His third wife had left him. He was deeply in debt. His last significant film, Too Much Too Soon, was a box office failure. In October of 1959, Flynn traveled to Vancouver with his 17-year-old girlfriend, a detail that appalled even his admirers, to try to sell his yacht. While attending a party, he complained of severe back pain. He went to lie down in a bedroom and died within minutes of a heart attack. He was 50 years old. The coroner who examined his body said it showed the wear of a man who had lived several lifetimes. He is interred at Forest Lawn, Glendale in the Garden of Everlasting Peace. From a man who lived recklessly to a man who fought for his country and then lost everything, let's make a solemn stop at Arlington National Cemetery in Virginia, just across the Potomac from Washington, D.C. Among the rows of white headstones honoring America's military dead, you'll find the grave of Joe Louis, the Brown Bomber, the man many consider the greatest heavyweight boxing champion who ever lived. Joseph Louis Barrow was born in 1914 in rural Alabama and grew up in Detroit. He turned professional in 1934 and became heavyweight champion of the world in 1937 by knocking out James Braddock. He held the title for nearly 12 years, the longest reign in heavyweight history, and successfully defended it 25 times. His most famous fight came in 1938, when he knocked out German boxer Max Schmeling in the first round at Yankee Stadium. With World War II looming and Schmeling portrayed as a symbol of Nazi supremacy, Lewis's victory made him a national hero and one of the first black athletes to achieve broad white approval in America. During the war, Lewis enlisted in the Army and donated his fight purses to military relief funds. This patriotism cost him dearly. The IRS determined that the donated money was still taxable income, and Louis spent the rest of his life trying to pay a debt that grew with interest faster than he could earn. He came out of retirement in the early 1950s and fought Rocky Marciano, who knocked him through the ropes. It was a painful end to a storied career. Lewis tried professional wrestling, worked as a greeter at a Las Vegas casino, and struggled with cocaine addiction and mental health issues in his later years. He died of cardiac arrest in 1981 at the age of 66. President Ronald Reagan waived the eligibility requirements so that Lewis could be buried at Arlington National Cemetery, a tribute to a man who had given everything for his country and received very little in return. From the boxing ring to the jazz club, let's travel to Kansas City, Missouri, and Lincoln Cemetery, a historically black burial ground on the city's east side. Here lies one of the most transformative musicians in the history of jazz, and one of the most self-destructive. Charlie Parker, known to the world as Bird, changed the sound of American music in a career that lasted barely 15 years. Parker was born in Kansas City in 1920 and grew up immersed in the city's thriving jazz scene. By his mid-teens, he was playing alto saxophone in local clubs, and by his early 20s, he had migrated to New York, where, along with Dizzy Gillespie, he invented bebop, a fast, complex, harmonically adventurous style of jazz that broke every rule of the swing era. Parker's improvisations were astonishing in their speed, creativity, and emotional depth. Musicians who heard him for the first time often couldn't believe what they were hearing. He was also a heroin addict from the age of 15. The drug ravaged his health and made him wildly unreliable. He missed gigs, pawned his saxophone, and was committed to a psychiatric facility in California after a breakdown in 1946. He came back, as he always did, and recorded some of his greatest work in the late 40s and early 50s. But his body was failing. On March 12, 1955, while visiting the apartment of his friend Baroness Panonica de Koenigswarter at the Stanhope Hotel in New York, Parker collapsed while watching television. He died 3 days later, on March 12th. He was 34. The coroner who examined his body estimated his age at 50 to 60. Parker was initially buried at Lincoln Cemetery in Kansas City, where a simple headstone marks his grave. His mother chose Kansas City over New York, wanting him to come home. From a musician who burned out too fast, let's turn to an actor who outlived almost everyone he knew, but ended up with almost nothing. Mickey Rooney rests at Hollywood Forever Cemetery in Los Angeles, one of the most famous burial grounds in the country. His niche is in the Abbey of the Psalms Mausoleum. If you are looking for the definition of child star, Mickey Rooney might be it. Born Joe Ewell Jr. in Brooklyn in 1920, he was performing in his parents' vaudeville act before he could walk. He started making films at the age of 6 and was one of the biggest box office draws in the world by the time he was 18. The Andy Hardy films, there were 16 of them, made him America's boy next door. He starred opposite Judy Garland in a series of beloved musicals. He was nominated for 4 Academy Awards and received 2 honorary Oscars over his career. He appeared in over 300 films, but Rooney was also married 8 times, and each divorce cost him. He trusted the wrong people with his money. His finances were a disaster for decades. In his final years, he spoke publicly before Congress about elder abuse, testifying that his stepson and his stepson's wife had taken control of his finances and isolated him from friends and family. When he died in 2014 at the age of 93, his estate was valued at $18,000. The man who had earned millions, who had been the #1 box office star in America ahead of Clark Gable and Spencer Tracy, left behind almost nothing. His grave at Hollywood Forever is a modest marker for a man who gave the movies nearly a century of his life. Staying at the topic of performers who dazzled audiences and died in debt, let's return to Forest Lawn, Glendale for a moment. Sammy Davis Jr., the man Frank Sinatra called the greatest entertainer who ever lived, is interred here in the Garden of Honor. Davis was born in Harlem in 1925 and was performing in vaudeville with his father and uncle by the age of 3. He could sing, dance, act, play multiple instruments, and do impressions that were so good they unnerved the people he was imitating. He served in the Army during World War II, where he encountered vicious racism from fellow soldiers that left deep scars. After the war, he threw himself back into performing with a fury that amazed everyone who saw him. He was a member of the Rat Pack alongside Sinatra, Dean Martin, Peter Lawford, and Joey Bishop, and starred in the original Ocean's 11 in 1960. His recording of The Candyman reached number 1 in 1972. He lost his left eye in a car accident in 1954 and wore a glass eye for the rest of his life. He converted to Judaism. His marriage to Swedish actress May Britt in 1960 was one of the most controversial interracial unions of its time and drew death threats. He hugged Richard Nixon on national television, a decision he regretted for years. Davis lived extravagantly. Enormous houses, fleets of cars, lavish parties, and prodigious spending on jewelry and gifts. He also had serious tax problems. When he died of throat cancer on May 16, 1990, at the age of 64, just 2 months after learning of his diagnosis, he owed the IRS somewhere between $5 and $7 million. His widow, Alta Weiss, inherited the debt and spent years trying to settle it with the help of Sammy's famous friends. The man who could do everything, sing, dance, act, impersonate, play the vibraphone, left this world owing more than he had ever saved. Let's shift gears now and travel across the Atlantic. In the sprawling, tree-shaded avenues of Père Lachaise Cemetery in Paris, the most visited necropolis in the world, lies a man whose wit once lit up London drawing rooms and whose final years were spent in poverty and exile. Oscar Wilde is buried in Division 89 beneath a striking Art Deco monument carved by sculptor Jacob Epstein, featuring a winged figure inspired by Assyrian art. Wilde was born in Dublin in 1854 and became the most celebrated playwright of the Victorian era. The importance of being earnest, an ideal husband, Lady Windermere's fan. These plays sparkled with epigrams that people still quote today. His novel, The Picture of Dorian Gray, shocked and thrilled readers in equal measure. He was a sensation, a celebrity, a provocateur who could fill a theater just by showing up. And then, in 1895, he was put on trial for gross indecency, a euphemism for his homosexual relationships, convicted and sentenced to 2 years of hard labor at Reading Jail. The sentence destroyed him. He emerged from prison broken in health and spirit, his literary reputation in ruins, his family shattered. His wife changed her name and took their sons. He fled to Paris under the assumed name Sebastian Melmoth. He spent his final years in a cheap hotel on the left bank, the Hotel d'Alsace, dependent on the charity of the few friends who had not abandoned him. He wrote almost nothing in those final years, except for The Ballad of Reading Jail, a poem about the cruelty of imprisonment. He died on November 30th, 1900 of meningitis, at the age of 46. He was reportedly penniless, and his friend Robbie Ross had to cover the funeral expenses. His tomb at Père Lachaise has become one of the most visited graves in the world. For years, visitors covered it with lipstick kisses until a glass barrier was installed to protect the stone. The hotel where he died is now a luxury establishment that has renamed its finest suite in his honor. Back to America now, and to a different kind of performer. Let's visit Kensico Cemetery in Valhalla, New York, a serene, hilly burial ground about 30 miles north of Manhattan. Here, in a modest plot, rests a man whose film career was brief but whose impact was seismic. Montgomery Clift was one of the most talented actors of his generation, Brando's only rival in the method acting revolution of the late 40s and 50s, and one of Hollywood's most tortured souls. Clift was born in Omaha, Nebraska in 1920 and began acting on Broadway as a teenager. His film debut in Red River opposite John Wayne announced the arrival of a new kind of leading man, sensitive interior, beautifully vulnerable, A Place in the Sun, From Here to Eternity, The Heiress. These performances earned him 4 Academy Award nominations. He was strikingly handsome with a face that the camera loved. Then came the accident. In May of 1956, after a dinner party at Elizabeth Taylor's house, Clift crashed his car into a telephone pole on the way down the hill. Taylor rushed to the scene and, according to witnesses, pulled 2 broken teeth from his throat to prevent him from choking. His face was shattered. Surgeons rebuilt it, but he was never the same, not physically, not emotionally. He was already struggling with alcoholism and his secret life as a gay man in an era when exposure would have ended his career. After the accident, his drinking intensified. He became unreliable on set. Insurance companies refused to cover him. He made a few more films, including The Misfits with Marilyn Monroe and Clark Gable, but his decline was visible to everyone. On July 23, 1966, Clift's personal secretary found him dead of a heart attack in his New York City townhouse. He was 45. The papers called it the longest act of self-destruction in Hollywood history, though in truth it was years of alcohol and prescription drugs that had weakened his heart. His grave at Kensico Cemetery is a small, flat marker. Elizabeth Taylor, who remained his closest friend until the end, is said to have kept a framed photo of Clift in her home for the rest of her life. Let's move now from the world of acting to the world of letters, and from New York back to the Deep South. In Atlanta, Georgia, at the historic Oakland Cemetery, an 88-acre Victorian garden cemetery opened in 1850, you'll find the grave of Margaret Mitchell, the woman who wrote the most famous novel about the American South ever published. She shares a modest white marble monument with her second husband, John Marsh. Mitchell was born in Atlanta in 1900 and grew up listening to stories about the Civil War from elderly relatives who had lived through it. She worked as a journalist for the Atlanta Journal before an ankle injury confined her to home, where she began writing a novel set during the Civil War and Reconstruction. It took her 10 years. She originally titled it Tomorrow is Another Day and named her heroine Pansy. Both were changed before publication. The title became Gone with the Wind and Pansy became Scarlet. The novel was published in 1936, sold 1 million copies in 6 months, and won the Pulitzer Prize. The film rights were sold to David O. Selznick for $50,000, the highest sum paid for film rights up to that time. The 1939 film, starring Vivian Leigh and Clark Gable, won 8 Academy Awards and remains one of the highest-grossing films in history when adjusted for inflation. Mitchell never wrote another novel. She answered fan mail, contributed to charitable causes including quietly funding scholarships for black medical students at Morehouse College, and lived as private a life as the most famous author in America could manage. On the evening of August 11, 1949, she and her husband were crossing Peachtree Street on their way to see a movie when she was struck by a speeding car driven by an off-duty taxi driver who was intoxicated. She never regained consciousness and died 5 days later at the age of 48. The driver served 11 months in prison for involuntary manslaughter. Mitchell is buried here at Oakland Cemetery, where her marker is one of the most visited in the grounds. She did not die alone or forgotten. She died suddenly, violently, at the height of her fame. But the abruptness of her end, and the fact that she only produced 1 novel, gives her story a particular poignancy. The world will always wonder what else she might have written. Let's leave the South and head to the Pacific Northwest, to a very different kind of story. In Seattle, Washington, at Lakeview Cemetery on Capitol Hill, overlooking Lake Washington, rests Bruce Lee, the martial artist and actor who almost single-handedly created the martial arts film genre and became a global icon before his sudden death at the age of 32. Lee was born in San Francisco in 1940 but grew up in Hong Kong, where he appeared in several films as a child actor. He returned to the United States as a teenager, studied philosophy at the University of Washington, and began teaching his own style of martial arts, which he called Jeet Kune Do, the way of the intercepting fist. He married Linda Emery, a fellow student, and the couple had 2 children. Hollywood noticed him when he played Kato in the television series The Green Hornet. But American producers were reluctant to cast an Asian man in a leading role. The most painful example came when Lee developed the concept for a television series called The Warrior, a martial arts western, only to see the idea turned into the show Kung Fu starring David Carradine, a white actor. The snub drove Lee back to Hong Kong, where he made a series of martial arts films, The Big Boss, Fist of Fury, Way of the Dragon, that shattered box office records across Asia and made him the biggest movie star in the Eastern Hemisphere. Warner Brothers finally backed Enter the Dragon, a film that would introduce Lee to American audiences on the biggest possible stage. He never saw it released. On July 20th, 1973, while visiting a friend in Hong Kong, Lee complained of a headache and took a pain reliever. He went to lie down and never woke up. The official cause of death was cerebral edema, brain swelling, possibly triggered by a reaction to the medication. He was 32. Enter the Dragon opened 6 days after his death and became a massive worldwide hit, earning over $200 million and transforming martial arts films into a global phenomenon. Lee is buried at Lakeview Cemetery beside his son, Brandon Lee, who would die under equally tragic circumstances 20 years later, killed by a malfunctioning prop gun on the set of The Crow. Father and son lie side by side, 2 lives cut impossibly short. From martial arts to the written word. Let's travel to Milledgeville, Georgia, a small college town about 100 miles southeast of Atlanta. In Memory Hill Cemetery, one of the oldest burial grounds in central Georgia, lies Flannery O'Connor, widely considered one of the greatest short story writers in the English language. O'Connor was born in Savannah in 1925 and grew up in Milledgeville. She was a devout Catholic in the Protestant South, and her fiction reflects that duality, darkly comic, violently redemptive, populated by grotesque characters who stumble toward grace. A good man is hard to find. Everything that rises must converge. The life you save may be your own. These stories are staples of American literature courses. She also wrote 2 novels, Wise Blood and The Violent Bear It Away, both of which baffled critics at the time and are now regarded as masterpieces. At the age of 25, O'Connor was diagnosed with lupus, the same autoimmune disease that had killed her father. She spent the last 14 years of her life on her family's dairy farm outside Milledgeville, writing, raising peacocks, and managing her illness with steroids that weakened her bones. She walked with crutches for years. She died on August 3, 1964, at the age of 39. Her complete stories, published posthumously, won the National Book Award in 1972. She is buried beside her father at Memory Hill, in a city that has preserved her legacy with a museum in her childhood home and peacock-themed celebrations in her honor. O'Connor did not die poor. She had modest means, and she was not forgotten by the literary world. But she died young, alone on that farm, far from the intellectual circles that admired her, knowing her body was failing and her time was short. The isolation of her final years shaped the urgency of her work. From the rural South to the avenues of Harlem, Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx, not to be confused with the smaller cemeteries of the same name, is one of the great burial grounds of New York, a 400-acre National Historic Landmark. Among the many luminaries interred here is Duke Ellington, born Edward Kennedy Ellington in Washington, D.C. in 1899, and one of the most important composers in American music history. Ellington led his orchestra for over 50 years, from the Cotton Club era through the Civil Rights Movement and beyond. Take the A Train, it don't mean a thing if it ain't got that swing. Mood Indigo, Sophisticated Lady. These compositions are the bedrock of the American songbook. He wrote over 1,000 pieces, from 3-minute pop songs to full-length suites and sacred concerts. He was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1969. Ellington was not poor when he died. He was wealthy and revered. But his final years were marked by a loneliness that surprised those around him. His longtime collaborator Billy Strayhorn, who wrote Take the A Train and many other pieces credited to the Ellington Orchestra, had died of cancer in 1967, and Ellington never fully recovered from the loss. He continued touring relentlessly, as if stopping would mean confronting the absence. He was diagnosed with lung cancer in early 1974 and died on May 24th of that year at the age of 75. Over 12,000 people attended his funeral at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine. He was buried at Woodlawn, where he shares the grounds with Miles Davis, another giant of jazz, along with such varied figures as Herman Melville, Joseph Pulitzer, and Celia Cruz. Let's head back to the West Coast now and make a stop that might surprise you. At the Inglewood Park Cemetery in Inglewood, California, in the Sunset Mission Mausoleum, rests Ella Fitzgerald, the First Lady of Song. Fitzgerald won 13 Grammy Awards, sold over 40 million records, and possessed a vocal range and improvisational ability that put her in a class entirely her own. She was born in Newport News, Virginia, in 1917 and grew up in Yonkers, New York. Her childhood was difficult. Her stepfather was abusive, and after her mother died, she bounced between relatives and reform schools. At 17, she won an amateur night contest at the Apollo Theater in Harlem, and her career was launched. She joined Chick Webb's orchestra and scored her first hit, A Tisket, A Tasket, in 1938. Over the next 5 decades, she became the most celebrated female jazz vocalist in the world. Her songbook series, albums devoted to the work of Cole Porter, Irving Berlin, Duke Ellington, and the Gershwins, are considered definitive interpretations. But in her later years, Fitzgerald's health declined severely. Diabetes cost her both legs below the knee. She was nearly blind. She spent her final years in her Beverly Hills home, largely out of the public eye. She died on June 15, 1996, at the age of 79. Her funeral was private, and she was buried at Inglewood Park. She was not impoverished, she had earned well and managed her money carefully, but her final years were spent in a kind of isolation that the woman who had once lit up every stage in the world would not have chosen. Let's continue south to San Diego. At Fort Rosecrans National Cemetery, which occupies a stunning promontory overlooking the Pacific at the tip of Point Loma, thousands of white headstones mark the graves of America's military dead. Among them is the grave of Junior Seau, the legendary San Diego Chargers linebacker. Tiina Ball Seau Jr. was born in 1969 in San Diego to a Samoan-American family. He played football at the University of Southern California and was drafted by the Chargers in 1990. For the next 20 years, he was one of the most dominant defensive players in the NFL. 12 Pro Bowl selections, named to the NFL's all-decade team of the 1990s. He was the heart of the Chargers' defense and a beloved figure in the San Diego community, where he ran a popular restaurant and a charitable foundation for at-risk youth. After retiring from football, Seau struggled. He suffered from insomnia, depression, and erratic behavior that friends and family attributed to the cumulative effects of head injuries sustained during his career. On May 2, 2012, he was found dead at his home in Oceanside, California. He was 43. A posthumous examination revealed that Seau suffered from chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE, a degenerative brain disease caused by repeated head trauma. His case became a landmark in the growing awareness of the link between football and brain damage. He was buried at Fort Rosecrans with military honors, owing to his father's service. He was posthumously inducted into the Pro Football Hall of Fame in 2015. Let's return to Ferncliff Cemetery in Hartsdale, New York, the same grounds where Judy Garland was originally interred, because it's also the resting place of another legend we should visit. Thelonious Monk, the pianist and composer who was one of the architects of modern jazz, is buried here. Monk was born in Rocky Mount, North Carolina in 1917 and grew up in Manhattan. He was largely self-taught as a pianist and developed a style that was utterly unlike anyone else's. Angular melodies, dissonant chords, unexpected silences, and a rhythmic sense that seemed to follow its own gravitational pull. Around Midnight, Straight, No Chaser, Blue Monk, Ruby, My Dear. These compositions are cornerstones of the jazz repertoire. Monk spent the 1940s playing at Minton's Playhouse in Harlem, where bebop was being born. He was there alongside Charlie Parker, whom we visited earlier, and Dizzy Gillespie. But while Parker and Gillespie became famous, Monk remained obscure for years, partly because his music was so unusual that even jazz fans didn't know what to make of it. His New York cabaret card was revoked in 1951, supposedly because of a drug arrest, though many believe the real reason was his refusal to inform on a friend. Without the card, he couldn't perform in New York clubs for 6 years. When recognition finally came in the late 50s, Monk enjoyed a period of critical and commercial success. He appeared on the cover of Time magazine in 1964, only the third jazz musician to do so, after Louis Armstrong and Dave Brubeck. But by the early 70s, he had withdrawn from public life almost entirely. He spent his final years living in the home of his patron, the Baroness Panonica de Koenigswarter, the same woman in whose apartment Charlie Parker had died 2 decades earlier. Monk barely spoke, barely played, and rarely left the house. He died of a stroke on February 17, 1982, at the age of 64. His grave at Ferncliff is visited by jazz pilgrims from around the world. Let's leave New York now and fly across the country to a small, tucked-away cemetery in the Westwood neighborhood of Los Angeles. You could walk right past the entrance and never know it was there, hidden behind high-rise office buildings just off Wilshire Boulevard. Pierce Brothers Westwood Village Memorial Park covers barely 2.5 acres, making it one of the tiniest cemeteries in the city. And yet, one of the most famous women who ever lived rests here. Marilyn Monroe is interred in crypt number 24 in the Corridor of Memories, a simple wall of marble plaques on the western side of the grounds. Her marker reads only her name and her years, 1926 to 1962. The stone has turned faintly pink over the decades from the thousands of lipstick kisses pressed against it by visitors. It has to be replaced periodically because the cosmetic residue eats into the marble. Marilyn was born Norma Jean Mortensen in Los Angeles in 1926. Her mother suffered from mental illness and was institutionalized when Norma Jean was a child. So the girl grew up shuffling between foster homes and an orphanage. She married at 16, partly to avoid going back into the foster system, and worked in a munitions factory during the war before a photographer noticed her and suggested she try modeling. Within a few years, she had bleached her hair, changed her name, and signed with 20th Century Fox. By the early 1950s, she was the biggest movie star in the world. Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, How to Marry a Millionaire, The 7-Year Itch, Some Like It Hot. Her comedic timing was extraordinary, and audiences could not get enough of her. But the woman behind the image was in constant pain. She suffered from severe insomnia, anxiety, and depression. She was married 3 times, to a merchant marine, to baseball great Joe DiMaggio, and to playwright Arthur Miller, and all 3 marriages ended. Studios treated her as a commodity. She was chronically late on set, not from vanity but from paralyzing stage fright that she managed with barbiturates and alcohol. By the summer of 1962, 20th Century Fox had fired her from the production of Something's Got to Give. She was 36, financially unstable, and increasingly isolated. On the night of August 4th, her housekeeper Eunice Murray was staying at the house at the request of Monroe's psychiatrist. Sometime in the early hours of August 5th, Murray noticed the light still on under Monroe's locked bedroom door and could not get a response. Monroe was found dead in her bed, a telephone receiver in her hand. The coroner ruled her death a probable overdose of barbiturates. Whether it was intentional, accidental, or something else entirely has been debated for over 60 years. Only about 30 people attended her funeral. Joe DiMaggio, who many believe never stopped loving her, arranged the service and barred most of Hollywood from attending. He had red roses delivered to her crypt 3 times a week for the next 20 years. What's remarkable about this cemetery is that before Marilyn arrived, it was a quiet, forgotten little graveyard. She made it famous simply by being buried here. Today, Dean Martin, Natalie Wood, Jack Lemmon, Walter Matthau, Billy Wilder, and dozens of other luminaries are interred within steps of her crypt. Hugh Hefner paid $75,000 for the space right next to hers. In death, as in life, everyone wanted to be near Marilyn. Staying at Westwood Village Memorial Park, just a few rows from Marilyn Monroe, you'll find a ground-level marker for Truman Capote, one of the most gifted and most self-destructive American writers of the 20th century. Capote was born Truman Streckfus Persons in New Orleans in 1924 and raised by relatives in Monroeville, Alabama, where his childhood friend was Harper Lee. Yes, the author of To Kill a Mockingbird. They remained close for years. Lee based the character of Dill in her novel on the young Truman. Capote's early writing dazzled the literary world. Other Voices, Other Rooms, published when he was 23, made him a sensation. Breakfast at Tiffany's, published in 1958, created the iconic character of Holly Golightly. But his masterpiece was In Cold Blood, published in 1966. The true story of the murder of a Kansas farm family, written in a style Capote called the non-fiction novel. It became one of the best-selling true crime books in history and is considered a landmark of American literature. After In Cold Blood, Capote struggled to produce another major work. He spent years working on a novel called Answered Prayers, which was supposed to be his magnum opus. When excerpts were published in Esquire in 1975, they scandalized New York high society because Capote had used thinly veiled portraits of his wealthy friends, exposing their secrets. The social world that had embraced him turned its back overnight. Capote spiraled into alcoholism and drug addiction. He appeared on talk shows visibly intoxicated. His friends drifted away. He spent his final years drifting between homes, lonely and unable to write. He died on August 25, 1984, at the age of 59, at the home of Joanne Carson, Johnny Carson's ex-wife, in Bel Air. The official cause was liver disease complicated by multiple drug intoxication. He was cremated, and his ashes were interred here at Westwood, where they were later stolen and then returned after being auctioned. From a writer to a comedian. Let's drive out to Kensico Cemetery in Valhalla, New York, again. We visited Montgomery Clift here earlier, and find the grave of a man who made America laugh for decades but spent his last years in near isolation. Danny Kaye, born David Daniel Kaminsky in Brooklyn in 1911, was one of the most versatile entertainers of the mid-20th century. Kaye was a star of stage, film, and television. His performance in The Secret Life of Walter Mitty is iconic. He starred in Hans Christian Andersen, White Christmas with Bing Crosby, and The Court Jester, which contains one of the most famous comedy routines in film history. The pellet with the poisons in the vessel with the pestle. He could sing, dance, tell stories, do tongue-twisting patter songs at impossible speed, and reduce an audience to helpless laughter with nothing more than a facial expression. He was also deeply committed to UNICEF and spent years traveling the world on behalf of children. But Kaye's personal life was complicated. His marriage to songwriter Sylvia Fine, who wrote much of his best material, was reportedly unhappy. He had a long-rumored relationship with Sir Laurence Olivier. In his later years, he became passionate about cooking, Chinese cuisine specifically, and about piloting airplanes, and he gradually withdrew from show business. He developed hepatitis C from a blood transfusion and died of heart failure on March 3, 1987, at the age of 76. His funeral was small, and his grave at Kensico is a quiet, understated marker for a man who was anything but quiet or understated in life. Let's cross the country one more time, to Altadena, California, just north of Pasadena, and Mountain View Cemetery and Mausoleum. Here you'll find the grave of a man who was one of the biggest comedy stars of the silent era, and who spent decades in obscurity before the world remembered him. Harold Lloyd, along with Charlie Chaplin and Buster Keaton, formed the holy trinity of silent comedy. His most famous image, hanging from the hands of a clock high above a city street in the 1923 film Safety Last, remains one of the most iconic shots in cinema history. Lloyd was born in Burbank, Nebraska in 1893 and got into films as a teenager. Unlike Chaplin's Little Tramp or Keaton's Deadpan Acrobat, Lloyd's screen persona was an ordinary, optimistic young man. Glasses, straw hat, eager grin, who found himself in extraordinary situations. His films were enormously popular. At the peak of his career in the 1920s, he was wealthier than Chaplin or Keaton. He invested wisely in real estate and lived in a magnificent estate called Green Acres in Beverly Hills. But when talkies arrived, Lloyd's style fell out of fashion. He made only a handful of films after 1930 and gradually faded from public consciousness. For decades, he refused to allow his silent films to be shown on television, which meant that new generations never saw them. Chaplin and Keaton were rediscovered and celebrated. Lloyd was largely forgotten. He spent his later years as a wealthy but increasingly reclusive figure, pottering around his estate, taking photographs. He was an avid stereo photography hobbyist with over 100,000 color slides, and watching his legacy collect dust. He died of prostate cancer on March 8, 1971, at the age of 77. In recent years, his films have been restored and released, and Lloyd's reputation has been revived. But for a long time, the man on the clock was left hanging, from comedy to country. Let's head to Winchester, Virginia, the quiet Shenandoah Valley town where one of the greatest voices in country music was born and is now buried. At Shenandoah Memorial Park, you'll find the grave of Patsy Cline, born Virginia Patterson Hensley in Winchester, Virginia, in 1932, and one of the most influential female vocalists in the history of country music. Cline's voice was something apart, rich, smooth, aching with emotion, and capable of crossing the boundary between country and pop with effortless grace. Crazy, written by a young Willie Nelson and released in 1961, became her signature song and one of the most played jukebox records in American history. I Fall to Pieces, She's Got You, Walkin' After Midnight, each one is a standard. She was one of the first female country artists to headline her own concerts and to successfully cross over to the pop charts. Her personal life was turbulent. Her first marriage to Gerald Cline ended in divorce. Her second husband, Charlie Dick, was by many accounts possessive and volatile. She survived a near-fatal car accident in 1961 that put her through the windshield and left a scar across her forehead that she concealed with a wig for months. She was just hitting her stride, finally earning the recognition and money that matched her talent. When, on March 5, 1963, she died in a small plane crash near Camden, Tennessee, along with fellow country stars Hawkshaw Hawkins and Cowboy Copas. She was 30 years old. The pilot had been warned about severe weather but took off anyway. Cline's funeral in Winchester drew enormous crowds. She was later reinterred at a dedicated memorial site, the Shenandoah Memorial Park in Winchester. Her legacy only grew after her death. She was among the first artists inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame in 1973. Her tombstone reads, "Death cannot kill what never dies, love." Visitors still leave pennies on her marker, so many that the groundskeeper sweeps them away regularly. A bell tower was erected nearby by her fans, and it chimes on the hour in a cemetery that would be utterly unremarkable without her. From Winchester, let's head west to Nashville, Tennessee, and visit Harpeth Hill's Memory Gardens, where the grave of a man known mostly for one devastating performance can be found. Johnny Paycheck, the country singer whose real name was Donald Eugene Lytle, is buried here. Paycheck was born in Greenfield, Ohio, in 1938, and was playing steel guitar in Nashville by his teens. He worked as a session musician and backup singer for years before launching a solo career. His early hits were solid country fare, but the song that made him famous, or infamous, was "Take This Job and Shove It," released in 1977. It became an anthem for every working American who had ever fantasized about telling off the boss. The song went to #1 and was turned into a movie. But Paycheck's life off stage was chaos. He had a long history of alcohol and drug abuse, financial mismanagement, and run-ins with the law. In 1985, he shot a man in a bar in Hillsboro, Ohio. The man survived, and Paycheck was convicted of aggravated assault and sentenced to prison. He served about 2 years. After his release, he attempted a comeback with the help of George Jones, but his health was failing. He spent his final years in near poverty, relying on the generosity of fellow musicians. He died on February 19, 2003, at the age of 64, of complications from emphysema and other ailments. The man who told the world to take this job and shove it couldn't afford his own medical care at the end. From Nashville, let's journey to a place of quiet beauty in the hills of North Carolina. The Thomas Wolfe Memorial at Riverside Cemetery in Asheville marks the grave of one of America's most ambitious and least restrained novelists. Wolfe was born in Asheville in 1900 and grew up in a boarding house run by his mother, the setting he would later transform into the fictional Dixieland boarding house in his first novel, Look Homeward, Angel. That novel, published in 1929 when Wolfe was 28, scandalized Asheville because its characters were so obviously based on real townspeople that residents recognized themselves and their neighbors. Some refused to speak to Wolfe for years. But the book established him as one of the most exciting literary voices of his generation. He wrote with a volcanic energy, producing manuscripts so enormous that his editor, Maxwell Perkins, had to cut hundreds of thousands of words. Of Time and the River, The Web, and The Rock, You Can't Go Home Again. Each one poured from him in torrents of lyrical, autobiographical prose. Wolfe was 6 feet 6 inches tall, perpetually restless, and seemingly incapable of moderation in anything: writing, eating, drinking, or traveling. In the summer of 1938, he fell ill during a trip to the Pacific Northwest. Doctors initially thought it was pneumonia, but it turned out to be tuberculosis of the brain, which had spread from an old lung infection. He was brought to Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore, where he died on September 15, 1938, at the age of 37, 18 days before his 38th birthday. He was buried back home in Asheville in Riverside Cemetery, where his grave overlooks the Blue Ridge Mountains. His mother's boarding house is now a state historic site. Asheville, the town that once shunned him, now claims him as its most famous son. From the mountains of North Carolina, let's make a long jump to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and Northwood Cemetery in the West Oak Lane neighborhood. Here lies a woman whose name may not be instantly familiar to everyone, but whose legacy shaped the sound of modern music more than almost anyone on this tour. Sister Rosetta Tharpe was born Rosetta Newbin in Cotton Plant, Arkansas in 1915, and she was the godmother of rock and roll, though she never received that credit during her lifetime. Tharpe played electric guitar with a ferocity and skill that predated Chuck Berry by more than a decade. She mixed gospel and secular music in a way that scandalized the church and electrified popular audiences. Her 1944 hit Strange Things Happening Every Day is considered by many historians to be one of the first rock and roll records. She influenced Elvis Presley, Little Richard, Chuck Berry, and Johnny Cash, all of whom acknowledged her. Little Richard said that hearing Tharpe as a child was the moment he knew what he wanted to do with his life. But the music industry didn't know what to do with a black woman who played electric guitar in the 1940s and 50s. She fell out of the mainstream by the 60s, though she continued performing in churches and at European festivals where she was still revered. She suffered a stroke in 1970, and complications from diabetes led to the amputation of a leg. She died on October 9, 1973 in Philadelphia at the age of 58 after suffering another stroke on the eve of a scheduled recording session. For decades, she was almost completely forgotten by the American mainstream. Her grave at Northwood Cemetery was unmarked for over 30 years until fans raised money for a headstone. It wasn't until 2018 that she was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and the ceremony acknowledged what musicologists had been saying for years. Rock and roll did not begin with Elvis. It began with Sister Rosetta Tharpe, from music to painting, and from Philadelphia to the Hudson Valley. At the Rockland Cemetery in Sparkle, New York, a small hamlet in Rockland County about 25 miles north of Manhattan, on a hillside overlooking the Hudson River, rests Edward Hopper, the painter whose images of American loneliness, diners, gas stations, hotel rooms, empty streets, define an entire emotional landscape. Hopper was born in Nyack, New York, in 1882, and studied art in New York City under Robert Henri. He struggled for decades to sell his work, supporting himself primarily as a commercial illustrator for magazines. It wasn't until he was in his early 40s that his paintings began to find an audience. Nighthawks, painted in 1942 and depicting 4 figures in a late-night diner, is one of the most reproduced images in American art. House by the Railroad, Office at Night, Automat, Morning Sun. Each one captures an atmosphere of stillness, solitude, and something ineffably American. His wife, Josephine, was his only model for virtually every female figure in his paintings. Hopper was famously taciturn and reclusive. He and Josephine had a volatile relationship. She was possessive and controlling, and he was emotionally remote. In his later years, he painted less and less, producing only a handful of canvases. He died on May 15, 1967, at the age of 84, in his studio on Washington Square in New York. Josephine died 10 months later and was buried beside him at the Rockland Cemetery. Hopper didn't die poor or forgotten. His work was in major museums by then, but the isolation that defined his paintings also defined his life. He is perhaps the only artist who could make a painting of someone sitting alone in a room feel like a portrait of an entire country. If you visit his grave at the Rockland Cemetery, you will notice that the view from the hillside, wide, quiet, overlooking the river, looks remarkably like a Hopper painting. From painting to photography, and from the Hudson Valley to Staten Island. At the Moravian Cemetery in New Dorp, on the south shore of Staten Island, lies a woman who spent much of her life in obscurity, despite creating some of the most remarkable photographs of the 20th century. Vivian Maier was born in New York in 1926 and worked most of her adult life as a nanny in Chicago. In her spare time, she took photographs, over 150,000 of them, primarily street photography of extraordinary quality, capturing the faces and moments of everyday urban life with an eye that rivaled the best professionals in the field. The remarkable thing about Maier's story is that she never showed her work to anyone. She never exhibited, never published, never sought recognition. She kept the negatives and rolls of undeveloped film in boxes and storage lockers, and much of it she never even developed. The photographs were discovered by accident in 2007 when a man named John Maloof purchased a box of her negatives at a storage locker auction in Chicago for less than $400. When he began developing and scanning them, he realized he had stumbled onto the work of a major artist. Maier had died just 2 years later, in 2009, at the age of 83, in a nursing home. She had been living in reduced circumstances, supported by 3 of the families she had worked for as a nanny. She never knew that her photographs would be seen by millions, displayed in galleries around the world, and celebrated in a documentary film. Maier is buried at the Moravian Cemetery on Staten Island, where she had family roots. Her story raises questions about art and recognition that have no easy answers. Was she a genius who chose obscurity, or a troubled woman who couldn't bring herself to share her vision? People who knew her described her as intensely private, sometimes difficult, and fiercely independent. She walked the streets of Chicago with a Rolleiflex camera hung around her neck, shooting from the hip, capturing faces and gestures and shadows with an eye that rivaled the best professionals in the field. Either way, her photographs speak for themselves. She died unknown, and the world found her anyway. Let's shift from the visual arts to the world of science and make a stop at a cemetery you might not expect on this tour. At the Princeton Cemetery in New Jersey, among the graves of university professors and small-town residents, lies one of the most revolutionary physicists who ever lived. Not Einstein, he was cremated and his ashes scattered, but rather Kurt Gödel, the Austrian-born mathematician and logician whose incompleteness theorems fundamentally changed our understanding of mathematics and logic. Gödel was born in 1906 in Brunn, then part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and now Brno in the Czech Republic. In 1931, at the age of 25, he published his incompleteness theorems, which proved that in any consistent mathematical system, there are truths that cannot be proven within the system. This discovery shook the foundations of mathematics and philosophy. Einstein, who became Gödel's closest friend at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, said that in his later years, his own work was of little consequence, and he came to the Institute mainly for the privilege of walking home with Gödel. But Gödel suffered from severe mental illness, including intense paranoia. He was convinced that people were trying to poison him and would eat only food prepared by his wife, Adele. When Adele was hospitalized in late 1977, Godel simply stopped eating. He died on January 14, 1978, at Princeton Hospital, weighing just 65 pounds. The cause of death was listed as malnutrition and inanition caused by a personality disturbance. One of the greatest minds in human history starved himself to death because the one person he trusted to keep him safe was no longer able to cook for him. He was 71. His grave at Princeton Cemetery is a modest stone, visited mostly by mathematicians and philosophers who understand the magnitude of what he accomplished. From the abstract world of mathematics, let's pivot to something much lighter. Comedy. At Calvary Cemetery in East Los Angeles, one of the largest Catholic cemeteries in the western United States, rests Lou Costello, the chubby, befuddled half of the comedy duo Abbott and Costello. Born Louis Francis Castillo in Paterson, New Jersey, in 1906, Costello teamed up with Bud Abbott in the late 1930s, and the two became one of the most successful comedy acts in entertainment history. Their Who's On First routine is widely considered the greatest comedy sketch ever performed. They starred in over 30 films together, including Buck Privates, Hold That Ghost, and Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. At the peak of their popularity in the 1940s, they were the highest-paid entertainers in the world. But their partnership was fraught. They had bitter financial disputes. Abbott received 60% of their earnings, a source of constant resentment. Costello suffered personal tragedy when his infant son drowned in the family swimming pool in 1943. He went on stage that night because the show had been sold out, performing through his grief. By the mid-50s, the duo's popularity had waned, and they split up in 1957. Costello attempted a solo career, but managed only one film before his health failed. He died of a heart attack on March 3, 1959, just 3 days before his 53rd birthday. Abbott, devastated by the loss, never fully recovered and spent his remaining years in relative obscurity, dying of cancer in 1974. Costello is buried at Calvary Cemetery. Abbott is at an entirely different cemetery in the San Fernando Valley. In death, as in their final years, the partners went their separate ways. From comedy partners who split up to a literary partnership that ended in tragedy. Let's visit the Bowman Cemetery in Hamilton, Massachusetts, about 30 miles north of Boston. Here lies John Cheever, one of the most celebrated short story writers of the 20th century, known as the Chekhov of the suburbs. Cheever was born in Quincy, Massachusetts in 1912 and spent most of his career chronicling the hidden despair beneath the manicured lawns of American suburban life. His stories appeared regularly in The New Yorker for decades. The Swimmer, in which a man decides to swim home through all the pools in his wealthy neighborhood and arrives to find his house empty and locked, is one of the most anthologized stories in American fiction. His novel, The Wapshot Chronicle, won the National Book Award, and his collected stories of John Cheever won the Pulitzer Prize in 1979. Behind the elegant prose was a man in terrible pain. Cheever was an alcoholic who struggled with his addiction for most of his adult life. He was also bisexual in an era when this was deeply closeted, and his secret tormented him. His journals, published posthumously, revealed the depth of his anguish, his self-loathing, his loneliness, his battles with drink. He finally got sober in the mid-70s and enjoyed a brief period of clear-eyed productivity before being diagnosed with cancer. He died on June 18, 1982, at the age of 70. His grave at Bowman Cemetery is in a peaceful New England setting that could easily be the backdrop for one of his stories about the quiet desperation lurking behind a picket fence. From suburban despair to urban glamour and back again. Let's fly across the country to Los Angeles and visit the Westwood Village Memorial Park one last time. We've visited Marilyn Monroe and Truman Capote here already, but there's one more person at Westwood whose story fits our tour. Rodney Dangerfield, born Jacob Rodney Cohen in Babylon, New York, in 1921. The comedian who built an entire career on the catchphrase, "I get no respect," is buried here. Dangerfield started performing stand-up in his teens under the name Jack Roy, but he couldn't make a living at it and gave up comedy for 12 years to sell aluminum siding. He returned to stand-up in his 40s under the name Rodney Dangerfield and finally found his audience. His bug-eyed, tie-tugging, put-upon persona was a sensation. He became a fixture on The Tonight Show, appeared in hit films like Caddyshack and Back to School, and opened his own comedy club, Dangerfield's in New York, where he gave early breaks to performers like Jim Carrey, Roseanne Barr, and Jerry Seinfeld. But the no-respect routine wasn't entirely an act. Dangerfield suffered from depression for most of his life. He told interviewers that performing was the only thing that made him feel alive, and that without the stage, he didn't know how he would have survived. He battled health problems for years, including heart surgery and a brain surgery that left him in a coma for weeks. He died on October 5, 2004, at the age of 82. His headstone at Westwood bears the perfect epitaph in keeping with his lifelong joke, "Rodney Dangerfield, there goes the neighborhood." Let's leave Los Angeles behind now and make our way to a very different landscape. In Flat Rock, North Carolina, at Hendersonville's Oakdale Cemetery, rests Carl Sandburg, the poet, biographer, and folk musician who was once called the Voice of America. Sandburg was born in Galesburg, Illinois, in 1878, the son of Swedish immigrants. He left school after 8th grade and worked as a milk deliverer, bricklayer, and dishwasher before enlisting in the Army during the Spanish-American War. After the war, he attended Lombard College and began writing poetry. His 1916 collection, Chicago Poems, which included the famous opening line, "Hog Butcher for the World," established him as one of America's most important poets. He went on to write a monumental 6-volume biography of Abraham Lincoln that won the Pulitzer Prize. He won a second Pulitzer for his complete poems in 1951. He also collected and performed American folk songs, traveling with a guitar long before the folk revival of the 1960s. Sandburg spent his final years at Connemara, a farm in Flat Rock, North Carolina, where he and his wife raised goats. He continued writing and giving readings well into his 80s. He died on July 22, 1967, at the age of 89. He was not poor, and he was not forgotten. He was, in fact, one of the most honored literary figures in America. But there's something fitting about visiting his grave in this quiet southern town, far from the Chicago stockyards and the Lincoln Memorial. He lived long enough to become a legend, and wise enough to retreat to a farm where the only audience was a herd of goats. Let's turn the page to a very different chapter of American history. At Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn, New York, one of the most magnificent cemeteries in the country, with rolling hills, ornate mausoleums, and sweeping views of the New York harbor, lies a man who is largely forgotten today, but who was once one of the most powerful newspaper publishers in the country. Horace Greeley, founder of the New York Tribune, and the man who popularized the phrase, "Go West, young man," is buried here. Greeley was born in Amherst, New Hampshire in 1811 and arrived in New York at the age of 20 with $10 in his pocket. He founded the Tribune in 1841 and turned it into one of the most influential newspapers in American history, using it to crusade against slavery, promote Western expansion, and advocate for labor rights. He hired Karl Marx as a foreign correspondent and published the work of Margaret Fuller, one of the earliest feminist intellectuals. He was a tireless reformer, against capital punishment, in favor of public education, vocal about the rights of workers at a time when such positions were considered radical. He ran for president in 1872 against Ulysses S. Grant, carrying the banner of the Liberal Republican Party, and was defeated in one of the most lopsided elections in American history. The campaign was devastating. His wife had died just days before the election. He was exhausted, grieving, and humiliated. In the weeks after his defeat, his behavior became increasingly erratic. He was unable to sleep, refused food, and was admitted to a private sanitarium. He died on November 29, 1872, at the age of 61, just 24 days after the election. The cause was listed as exhaustion and brain inflammation. His funeral at City Hall was attended by President Grant and thousands of mourners. But within a generation, the man who had shaped American journalism was largely forgotten by the public. His grave at Greenwood, marked by a monument, is visited mostly by history enthusiasts. From a 19th century newspaperman to a 20th century television pioneer. Let's head to Gate of Heaven Cemetery in Hawthorne, New York, about 30 miles north of Manhattan. Here, in a section near the main entrance, lies the grave of Sal Mineo, the actor who became famous as a teenager and died under violent circumstances at the age of 37. Salvatore Mineo Jr. was born in the Bronx in 1939, the son of Sicilian immigrants. He was expelled from school and seemed headed for juvenile delinquency when his mother enrolled him in acting classes. He was a natural. By the age of 11, he was performing on Broadway, and at 16 he landed the role that made him famous, Plato, the vulnerable, adoring sidekick of James Dean's character in Rebel Without a Cause. The performance earned him an Academy Award nomination for Best Supporting Actor. He received another nomination 2 years later for Exodus. But Hollywood didn't know what to do with Mineo once he grew out of juvenile roles. He was openly bisexual at a time when that was career poison. The roles dried up. He turned to directing and stage work and was attempting to rebuild his career when, on February 12, 1976, he was stabbed to death in the alley behind his apartment in West Hollywood after returning home from a rehearsal. He was 37. The killing appeared random, a botched robbery, and it took over 2 years for the police to arrest and convict his killer, a pizza delivery man with no connection to the entertainment industry. Mineo's grave at Gate of Heaven is a flat marker in a cemetery he shares with Babe Ruth, Billy Martin, and James Cagney. Much bigger names, but none with a story quite as haunting as his. Let's shift from tragedy to triumph, and then back to tragedy. We're going to the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific, commonly known as Punch Bowl, in Honolulu, Hawaii. This extinct volcanic crater holds the remains of over 50,000 American service members, and among them is Ernie Pyle, the war correspondent who became the most beloved journalist of World War II. Pyle was born near Dana, Indiana, in 1900, and began working as a newspaper reporter in his early 20s. He became a roving columnist, traveling the country and writing about ordinary Americans in a conversational, empathetic style that readers loved. When World War II began, he went overseas and embedded himself with infantrymen in North Africa, Italy, and France, writing columns that told the war from the perspective of the common soldier. While other correspondents focused on strategy and generals, Pyle wrote about the men who slept in foxholes and ate cold rations and missed their wives. His column about Captain Henry Wascow, a beloved company commander killed in Italy, is considered one of the finest pieces of journalism ever written. His writing was so vivid and so compassionate that he became a national hero. He won the Pulitzer Prize for correspondence in 1944. Soldiers adored him because he shared their hardships and told their stories without glamorizing the horror. He was slight, balding, and soft-spoken, not the image of a war hero, but the troops considered him one of their own. On April 18, 1945, during the battle for the island of Ishima near Okinawa, Pyle was riding in a jeep when a Japanese machine gunner opened fire. He dived into a ditch alongside an army officer. When he raised his head, a bullet struck him in the left temple and killed him instantly. He was 44. He was initially buried on Ishima with a simple wooden marker that soldiers made from scrap lumber. His remains were later moved to the Punch Bowl Cemetery in Honolulu, where he rests among the men whose stories he told so well. He was a journalist who died in the field, doing the work he believed in, and his grave is surrounded by the soldiers he honored. From the Pacific Theater to the Pacific Coast. In Colma, California, a small town just south of San Francisco that is known as the City of the Dead because it has more cemeteries than any other municipality in the Bay Area, you'll find Cypress Lawn Memorial Park. And at Cypress Lawn lies Wyatt Earp, the Old West lawman whose name is synonymous with the gunfight at the OK Corral. Earp was born in Monmouth, Illinois in 1848 and led a life that reads like fiction. He was a buffalo hunter, a stagecoach driver, a saloon owner, a gambler, and a lawman in the roughest towns of the frontier, Wichita, Dodge City, and Tombstone, Arizona. The famous gunfight at the OK Corral in October 1881, in which Earp, his brothers Virgil and Morgan, and Doc Holliday shot it out with the Clanton and McLaury gang, lasted about 30 seconds and has been depicted in dozens of films and television shows. After Tombstone, Earp drifted. He mined for gold in Alaska during the Klondike Rush, refereed boxing matches, and spent his final decades in Los Angeles, where he befriended early Hollywood figures including Tom Mix and John Wayne, who later said Earp was a major influence on his screen persona. Earp died on January 13, 1929, at the age of 80, in a small apartment in Los Angeles. He was not poor, he lived comfortably, but he died in relative obscurity, just another old man in a growing city that had no use for frontier legends. His wife Josephine had him cremated and buried at Cypress Lawn because it was her family's burial ground. The myth of Wyatt Earp didn't fully take hold until after his death, when Stuart Lake's biography, published in 1931, turned him into the quintessential Western hero. From the Old West to Old Hollywood. Let's drive back to Los Angeles and visit one more cemetery, the Hollywood Forever Cemetery on Santa Monica Boulevard, one of the most famous and atmospheric burial grounds in the country. We'll spend some time here because several of our subjects rest within its walls. First, in the Cathedral Mausoleum, you'll find the ashes of Peter Lorre, the Hungarian-born actor whose soft voice and large, mournful eyes made him one of the most recognizable character actors in film history. Lorre was born Laszlo Lowenstein in Rozsahegi, Austria-Hungary, now Ružomberok, Slovakia, in 1904. He made his name in Germany with Fritz Lang's M in 1931, playing a child murderer with a performance so chilling and so sympathetic that it remains one of the landmarks of cinema. When the Nazis came to power, Lorre, who was Jewish, fled to England and then to Hollywood, where he became indispensable. Joel Cairo in The Maltese Falcon, Ugarte in Casablanca, handing those letters of transit to Humphrey Bogart. The sinister Mr. Moto in a series of detective films. He was in everything, and he elevated everything he was in. But Hollywood never gave Lorre leading roles worthy of his talent. He was typecast as the creepy foreigner, the oily villain, the bug-eyed eccentric. He struggled with chronic pain from gallbladder problems and became addicted to morphine. His weight ballooned. By the early 60s, the roles had dried up almost completely. He took whatever work came along, including low-budget Roger Corman horror films alongside his old friend Vincent Price. He was in the process of divorcing his third wife when, on March 23, 1964, he was found dead on the floor of his small Hollywood apartment near a bedroom window he had apparently been trying to open. He had suffered a massive stroke. He was 59 and had almost no money. Vincent Price delivered the eulogy. The connection to our tour runs deep. At Bela Lugosi's funeral in 1956, Lorre and Price had been among the mourners, and Lorre reportedly quipped, upon seeing Lugosi in his Dracula cape, whether they should take any precautions, a dark joke between two men who knew the horror business inside and out. Now they are all gone, and Lorre's ashes rest here at Hollywood Forever. Just a few steps away, in the same cemetery, is the man who was, arguably, the first movie star, Rudolph Valentino. Valentino was born Rodolfo Alfonso Raffaello Pier Filibert Guglielmi di Valentina d'Antongola in Castellaneta, Italy, in 1895. He emigrated to the United States in 1913 and worked as a busboy, a gardener, and a taxi dancer before landing small roles in films. His breakthrough came in The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse in 1921, followed by The Sheik, Blood and Sand, and The Eagle. He became the biggest sex symbol in the world. Women fainted at his appearances, and men were simultaneously jealous and fascinated. His career was brief. On August 15, 1926, Valentino collapsed at a hotel in New York and was rushed to the hospital with a perforated ulcer and appendicitis. He developed peritonitis after surgery and died on August 23 at the age of 31. The public reaction was unlike anything the entertainment world had ever seen. An estimated 100,000 people lined the streets of New York for his funeral. Riots broke out at the funeral home. His body was shipped by train to Hollywood, where he was interred at what is now Hollywood Forever Cemetery. For decades, a mysterious woman in black, the Lady in Black, visited his crypt on the anniversary of his death, leaving a single red rose. The tradition continued for years, with different women taking up the role, though it has faded in recent times. Valentino's crypt is in the Cathedral Mausoleum, and it remains one of the most visited sites in the cemetery. Just a short walk from Valentino within Hollywood Forever, you can find the memorial of another figure whose story connects to our tour's theme of forgotten fame. Jane Mansfield, the platinum blonde bombshell of the 1950s who was one of the biggest sex symbols of her era, has a cenotaph here, though her body is actually buried at Fairview Cemetery in Penn Argyl, Pennsylvania, her hometown. Mansfield was born Vera Jane Palmer in Bryn Mawr, Pennsylvania, in 1933. She was smart. She reportedly had an IQ of 163 and spoke 5 languages. But she chose to market herself as a voluptuous blonde in the mold of Marilyn Monroe. She became famous for publicity stunts, for her 40-inch bust, and for films like The Girl Can't Help It and Will Success Spoil Rock Hunter? She won a Golden Globe for New Star of the Year in 1957. But by the early 1960s, the roles had dried up. She turned to nightclub acts and low-budget European films. On June 29, 1967, Mansfield was traveling from a nightclub engagement in Biloxi, Mississippi, to New Orleans with her attorney companion Sam Brody and 3 of her 5 children who were asleep in the back seat. Their car plowed into the rear of a tractor trailer in the dark. Mansfield, Brody, and the driver were killed instantly. The children survived. She was 34. Her death led to a federal requirement that trucks have underride guards. The metal bars you see hanging from the back of semis are sometimes called Mansfield bars in her honor. An odd and grim legacy for a woman who wanted nothing more than to be noticed. From Hollywood back to literature for our final stretch. Let's travel to Salinas, California, the agricultural heartland of the Central Valley, and to the Garden of Memories Cemetery. Here, in the Hamilton family plot, lie the cremated remains of John Steinbeck, one of the towering figures of American literature, the author of The Grapes of Wrath, of Mice and Men, East of Eden, and Cannery Row. Steinbeck was born in Salinas in 1902 and spent his early career writing about the working poor of the Central Valley with a compassion and realism that made comfortable Americans squirm. The Grapes of Wrath, published in 1939, told the story of the Joad family's migration from Dust Bowl, Oklahoma to California and became one of the most controversial and influential novels in American history. It won the Pulitzer Prize and was a key factor in Steinbeck's Nobel Prize for Literature in 1962. But the Nobel came with a sting. The Swedish Academy's citation was lukewarm, and many critics felt Steinbeck's best work was behind him. The New York Times editorial page openly questioned whether he deserved the prize. The criticism wounded him deeply. His later novels received mixed reviews. His support for the Vietnam War alienated many of his liberal admirers. His health declined. He suffered a series of small strokes and heart attacks. He died on December 20th, 1968, at the age of 66, at his apartment in New York City. His wife Elaine was by his side. He was not alone in the physical sense, but in his final years, he felt increasingly out of step with the literary world and the culture at large. He had told his wife he couldn't stand to be buried in foreign soil, so his ashes were brought back to Salinas, the place he wrote about with such devotion. His grave in his hometown is a fitting final address for the man who told America about its own working poor. For our final visit, let's return to the Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx, our third stop here today, because there is one more person we must see before this tour ends. Herman Melville, the author of Moby Dick, one of the most important novels ever written in the English language, and a man who died in such obscurity that his obituary in the New York Times misspelled his name. Melville was born in New York City in 1819 and went to sea as a young man, working on whaling ships and merchant vessels. His early novels, based on his South Pacific adventures, Taipei and Omu, were popular successes. But when he published Moby Dick in 1851, the public was bewildered. The novel, a sprawling, philosophically dense epic about a sea captain's obsession with a white whale, sold poorly and received mixed reviews. His next novel, Pierre, was a critical disaster. By his mid-30s, Melville's literary career was effectively over. He spent the last 3 decades of his life working as a customs inspector on the New York docks, earning $4 a day. He wrote poetry that went largely unread and worked on a novella called Billy Budd that was not published until 1924, over 30 years after his death. He died on September 28, 1891, at the age of 72. The New York Times obituary called him Henry Melville. He was buried at Woodlawn Cemetery, and for decades his grave attracted almost no visitors. The rediscovery of Moby Dick in the 1920s, led by scholars who recognized its genius, transformed Melville from a forgotten customs inspector into one of the giants of world literature. Today, his grave at Woodlawn is easy to find. There's usually a small stone or leaf arrangement left by a reader. But it took the world 70 years to realize what it had in Herman Melville. And that brings us to the end of our journey. We have visited 50 graves across the United States and beyond. Actors and authors, musicians and inventors, athletes and artists, comedians and composers. Some were found alone in hotel rooms. Some died in the back seats of cars on lonely highways. Some were buried as John Does in unmarked trenches. Others had grand funerals and still died with nothing in the bank. A few were denied a resting place among their peers because of the color of their skin. What they share is not just fame, but the fragility of it. Fame is a borrowed suit. It can be taken back at any time, and when it's gone, you're left with only what you brought with you. The applause fades. The royalty checks stop coming. The phone stops ringing. And what remains is a person. A human being who laughed and wept and worried about money and wanted to be loved. Standing in a room that used to be full and is now very, very quiet. But here is the other thing these stories teach us. The work endures. The films of Buster Keaton are still making people laugh 100 years later. Billie Holiday's voice can still stop you in your tracks. Moby Dick, once dismissed as an unreadable failure, is now recognized as one of the greatest novels ever written. Sister Rosetta Tharpe's guitar riffs echo in every rock and roll song you have ever heard, whether the musicians who played them knew her name or not. The graves are small and still, but the work is alive and restless, and it will outlast us all. Thank you for walking with us. The graves will be here tomorrow, and the day after that, and the stories they hold are not going anywhere. If you learned something you didn't know, or remembered someone you'd forgotten, then this tour has done its work. Safe travels home.